Today, we're diving into a new report from the Alliance for Racial Justice, and it has a pretty bold title: A Better Way to Tackle Institutional Racism. So, what's their big idea for fixing a problem that's been around for decades? Let's get into it.
The report kicks off with a really powerful question. It's been well over a decade since the UK passed this big landmark Equality Act, a law that was supposed to create a more equal Britain. So why are we still talking about this? Why does institutional racism feel like such a stubborn, persistent problem?
And to bring this into really sharp focus, the report points to the recent Baroness Casey review of the Met Police. It highlights a very common response from big institutions, right? Blame a few bad apples instead of taking a hard look at the barrel itself. This perfectly sets up the problem we're exploring.
Okay, before we go any further, it's super important that we're all on the same page with this definition. The report uses the one from the Macpherson Inquiry, and the key thing here is that it's not about individual prejudice. It's about a collective failure, a failure in the processes and culture of an organization. It can happen without anyone even meaning for it to, through things like unwitting prejudice and thoughtlessness. So we're talking about the system, not just the people in it.
So, with that definition in mind, how does this actually play out? The report calls the 2010 Equality Act a promise unfulfilled. Basically, a huge law that sounds good on paper, but just isn't working the way it was supposed to.
You can kind of see where things went wrong when you look at the timeline. The act passes in 2010, a massive deal. But just 2 years later, one of its key tools got seriously weakened. These things called equality impact assessments. They were meant to check if new policies would be discriminatory. But when the government started calling them a non-legal requirement, it pretty much sent a signal to public bodies that they could just do the bare minimum.
This leads us right into the next part of the report's analysis, really diagnosing the core weaknesses in the law itself. What are the cracks in the foundation that let institutional racism keep happening?
And it really boils down to two fundamental issues. The language in the law is just too weak, and there's a serious lack of accountability. And these two problems, they kind of work together to undermine the whole point of the act.
Now have a look at this. It might seem like a small change in wording, but believe me, it changes everything. Right now, the law only asks public bodies to have due regard for equality. But what does that even mean? It's so vague. The report's proposed change is so much stronger, requiring them to take all practical steps. It's the difference between just thinking about equality and actually having to do something about it.
And on top of that weak language, there are other pretty big gaps. The Equality Act doesn't even define what institutional racism is, and it's not great at handling what's called intersectionality. You know, the idea that people can face discrimination based on a mix of things, like being a black woman, for example. The law kind of forces you to pick one, which just isn't how discrimination works in the real world.
Okay, so the law definitely has its problems, but this report isn't just about pointing out all the flaws. It's about figuring out how to forge stronger tools to fix them. So how can the law actually be upgraded?
The Alliance for Racial Justice lays out a really clear 4-step plan. Step 1. Fix the language. Make it direct and finally put a definition of institutional racism in there. Step 2. Make those equality impact assessments mandatory again. Step 3. Create real tough consequences for organizations that don't do what they're supposed to. And 4. Beef up the protections for intersectional identities.
But here's the reality check. You could have the most perfect law on the books, but if you can't enforce it, it's pretty much useless. And enforcement, as the report makes crystal clear, is a massive hurdle.
So, why is it so hard to enforce? Well, for one, the burden of challenging a huge public body usually falls on one person, and that is emotionally and financially draining. On top of that, the official regulator has had its budget slashed, and there just aren't enough specialist lawyers or legal aid to go around.
And let's look at a real-world example of this. The charity Friends, Families, and Travelers had to support 6 different legal challenges in just 3 years to fight discrimination against Gypsy and Traveler people. They fought for years, going all the way to the Supreme Court. It just shows the incredible and, frankly, often unaffordable amount of effort it takes to see a case through.
This brings us to a really important pivot in the report's argument. Because, okay, legal fixes are one thing, but what about the culture inside these institutions? This next part argues that laws by themselves just can't solve the whole problem.
The thing is, institutional racism is often deeply baked into the history and culture of an organization. I mean, think about the Met Police again. Despite decades of inquiries, real cultural change has been painfully slow. You can't just pass a law and expect all of that to disappear overnight.
But it's not impossible to change things.
The report holds up the Care Quality Commission as a good example. Since 2015, they've had a system to track the experiences of their staff from ethnic minorities and compare them to their white colleagues. They publish all the data, make action plans, and report on their progress every single year. That's what a long-term commitment to changing the culture actually looks like.
But then you get the stark contrast. The report points to the inquiries for Grenfell and COVID, where lawyers said it was incredibly difficult to even get them to consider the role that race and racism might have played. It was the elephant in the room. And that just shows you how powerful the cultural resistance is to even talking about the issue, let alone actually fixing it. So, we've diagnosed the problems with the law, with enforcement, and with the culture. So, how does this report pull everything together into a new blueprint for equality? What's the big vision here?
What it wraps up with two big, bold ideas. First, a brand new Race Equality Act, one that is specifically designed to dismantle institutional racism and has a powerful, independent body to actually enforce it. And second, something really different, a public health approach. This means treating racism like you'd treat a public health crisis, with a strategy across all of government and action plans for every single department.
The end goal of all of this is a fundamental shift in how we think about this. Ending racial inequality can't just be a box-ticking exercise or some kind of add-on. It needs to become a core function of how government and public services operate every single day.
And that leaves us with the huge question that this whole report is wrestling with. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? To really tackle institutional racism, what has to come first? Do you change the laws to force the culture to change, or do you have to change the culture first so that the laws can actually work? It's definitely something to think about.